When you look at this 1939 Crosley, you might not realize it, but the guy behind this was a true visionary. I mean, he's the guy who looked at the automotive world and said, you know, there's all these cars out there. I bet people would like to buy automotive accessories. He made a fortune doing that. Then he looked at the world of radio and said, I think people would like to have an inexpensive radio they can use at home. He made a fortune doing that. Then he looked into the future with his crystal ball and he said, I think compact cars are going to be the way to go. Unfortunately, I think he lost a lot of money doing that. But it didn't mean he wasn't right. He just wasn't right at that exact moment. Hi there, Rick DeBrule here at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix, an amazing collection of more than 170 cars that tells the full story of the American automobile experience, something you have to see. And this 1939 Crosley, while it's really nothing more today than a footnote in that history, is really an interesting look into the future of where things were going to be going. Now, let's go back to the man before we talk about the car. Powell Crosley was a guy who came up with a lot of great ideas. His first big idea was, as I mentioned, selling automotive accessories. His first interesting idea was to come up with a thing that mounted on the radiator cap of a car, had 5 American flags. He sold a lot of those. He came up with an interesting way to come up with a rubber liner for inside tires. He sold a lot of those. He was making $1 million back in the early 1920s, which is an awful lot of money. And then he went from there to saying, you know what? This radio thing could be pretty interesting. What if we came up with a low-cost, inexpensive radio people could actually afford? Well, he's been dubbed the Henry Ford of radio because of that. His radios, his Crosley radios, were so inexpensive, everybody could buy them all over the country. And then from there, he went on to saying, well, you know, we've got these great radios, we need programming. He bought a radio station in Cincinnati, and well, he also owned the Cincinnati Reds, so he said, well, what if we were to play a game at night under the lights so people could listen to it at home? He was the first guy to do that. Then he came up with this idea of having daytime radio dramas. Well, today we think of them as soap operas, but that was his idea. His radio station was so powerful it could literally blanket the country. People could hear it everywhere because once again he realized what the American public wanted and how he could meet that need. But to be honest with you, while those were interesting businesses, at his heart, Powell Crosley was a car guy. In fact, he had a couple failed attempts to build cars to try to create automobile companies. And then in the mid-1930s, he said, I think I have a vision. Now you got to remember that in 1929, we had the Great Depression. People were still hurting. And so he said, I want to build a car that's inexpensive to buy and inexpensive to own so that the common man, the average guy, could buy it. And in fact, when this 1939 Crosley hit the showroom floors in 1939, the first car of its kind, it was billed as the car for the forgotten man. That's right, the guy who'd lost everything during the Depression. This was the car that was going to put him back on the road. This 1939 Crosley was really the beginning of the Crosley Car Company. When it debuted in 1939, the goal was simple. A car that started at $325. That was for the 2-seater. If you got the 4-seater version, it was going to be $350. Of course, by the time it, hit the showroom floors, the dealer floors, it cost just a little bit more than that. But that was the original idea. And you have to remember, at that point in time, if you were going to buy yourself a Ford or a Chevy, you were going to be spending closer to $700 for a base model. So this car was about half of what it was going to cost to get into a real full-size car. It still got you on the road, still got you where you were going, and it was a lot less expensive to be able to do that. Now, one of the interesting ideas that Powell Crosley had was, instead of coming up with a dealer network, he wanted it to be sold through stores, through hardware stores. He actually had a deal with Macy's to sell them through Macy's, and they sold some in the very beginning. He ultimately did end up having a dealer network because it just seemed more effective and more efficient as time went along. But it was a pretty interesting idea. Now, that first year, it was pretty difficult, to be honest with you. There were a lot of problems. You gotta remember, the world was gearing up for World War II. Coming up with supplies was complicated in itself. That first year, where they only started in about mid-year, they only sold about 2,000 of the Crosleys. But people wanted them. They began to think, well, maybe this is a good car to own. And like all other car manufacturers during World War II, well, guess what? He had to shut down production because his company was then going to be used for the war effort. And of course, like so many other car makers, he made an awful lot of money doing that. But there's an interesting story to tell, which is the fact that This was one of the last cars built in the United States as we went into World War II. And the reason being is it got great fuel mileage. The U.S. government looked at it and said, well, if we're going to tell people to buy a car or allow people to buy a car, then at least it's going to be a car that meets the needs of conservation, getting better fuel mileage. Well, this Crosley did exactly that. It was getting nearly 50 miles to the gallon. So people could buy this quite a ways into World War II and in 1942, when ultimately they had to shut down and then prepare for converting their factory over to munition supplies. But they did come out on the other end after World War II. All right, a quick footnote before we go too deep into the story of the Crosley, and that's the fact that this really wasn't the first small American car. You'd have to give that credit to something called the American Bantam. But the American Bantam really wasn't a fully American car because it spun out of a company called American Austin, which basically licensed a car that was being sold in England, the Austin, and was selling it in the United States. It didn't really go over very well, to be honest with you. Of course, part of the problem was the Depression in the 1930s, and ultimately American Austin went bankrupt. And then it was bought out by American Bantam. American Bantam recreated it back in the mid-30s and started building what is truly a very interesting and unique American car. It was actually very pretty in its day. It was really, though, not an economy car. It was just a small American car. And in fact, the price was very, very big. It was close to a full-size car because what they were doing was taking everything they had in a full-size car and putting it in that smaller American Bantam. But that's not the vision that Crosley had. Crosley said, I want something completely different. I want an inexpensive car for the common man. Now, interesting story about American Bantam. It did not survive World War II. They went into World War II and did not come out as a car maker on the other side. But they do have an important footnote in history because they were part of the creation of the Jeep as we know it today. But Crosley, well, they did survive past World War II. Simplicity was critical to Crosley and his plan for an inexpensive car, and it's especially true under the hood. By the way, I love the way you open the hood, this hood ornament that moves to the side. It's very nice looking, and then you just pull it right up. Underneath that hood, down inside there, is a 2-cylinder air-cooled motor, made it up to a 3-speed transmission. Horsepower? Well, only good for about 12 horsepower. But you got to remember, it was the 1930s. Horsepower really wasn't the big thing. And it goes back to the goal wasn't to go as fast as you could. The roads were pretty bad anyway. The goal was just to get where you could while you could. And this motor is very tiny. As you look down inside, you can see that little carburetor sitting up on top, the air intake. But once again, it actually worked perfectly fine for what they wanted it to do. They were taking inspiration from the aviation world and coming up with a similar design to what was working in airplanes and putting it into an automobile. They had a lot of other innovations that were pretty creative as well. For example, they were using regular drum brakes, but they had a way of changing out the lining that was really simple and easy. Interesting story, about a decade later, Crosley was the first production car in the United States to use disc brakes. That's right, their Crosleys actually had disc brakes. They were brakes that actually came out of, once again, an aviation-inspired era, but it wasn't a success. In fact, they had all kinds of problems with them. They rusted out. They had to go back to drum brakes. But if you want to look at the beginning of the disc brake world, once again, Powell Crosley was a visionary. And of course, the styling of that 1939 Crosley, well, they tried to look just like their big brothers, the Fords and the Chevy. They didn't actually need a grille up front, but since everybody had something in the front of the car pointed and looked like that, they did the same. The most important thing was probably those air inlets down below so they could get air into that air-cooled engine. Well, the Crosley was definitely a small car. It was not designed or sold for small people. Now, I'm 6 feet tall, and the reality is I actually fit in here quite comfortably. Got plenty of room to touch the pedals down below. Got plenty of headroom. In fact, one of the ads back in those days pitched it as a car that somebody who was 6'4" could fit in comfortably. Now, I'm not too sure about 6'4", but I can tell you, once again, at 6 feet, I easily pull that off. Looking though at the dashboard, it doesn't get much simpler than this, does it? I mean, yeah, you've got the speedometer, the amps, the oil pressure, not a lot of gauges, nothing fancy which is going on here, but it works just fine. Of course, you've got that 3-speed gear lever at the bottom. You've got the emergency brake down there. It was just enough to be comfortable without being comfortable, if you know what I mean. You could get a back seat, but that was going to cost you an extra $25. So now you're probably thinking, wait a minute, if this car is so basic, why is it that the car, when it was introduced in 1939, came in a convertible? Well, you have to think about it from a cost perspective. It was actually less expensive to not have a metal top going across the top and to have this relatively inexpensive piece of fabric that they could lay across the top than it was to come up with a full sedan or full coupe style body that had a lot more complications and a door that would then have to fit into it. Yeah, there were no windows here. It was a very, very simple concept. And having the convertible actually kind of played into that. By the way, one of their pitches back then when they were selling this too was that it was a true one-man convertible. The idea being that one person could fold it up and put it up on top, because some of the tops back then were pretty complicated. So their goal was to be as simple and easy to operate as someone could possibly want in a car. After World War II, Crosley tried to come up with new models that were a little more stylish. I love the looks of this one, trying to emulate exactly what the big car companies were doing. This is the 1948 version. You see it's got a full sedan top. It's even got those pontoon-style rear fenders. And by now, the price had more than doubled. It was almost $1,000 to buy this, but it was still a lot less expensive than what you were going to be spending if you were going to be buying one of the big cars. And there's something called the Crosley Hot Shot, which is relatively well known these days. It's kind of a cool little fun runabout. You'll notice it doesn't even have doors, although it does have big comfortable seats. And this was designed to be a fun runabout, and people actually raced them back then. In fact, interesting story, this car actually won the 6 Hours of Sebring. Now, how did it do that against Jaguars and cars that were a lot more competitive? Well, because back then they used something called the Index of Performance, which meant they were looking at the size of the engine and everything else. And in doing so, the Crosley Hot Shot managed to become the overall winner at Sebring. Hard to believe. One of the interesting things about Crosley was they built all kinds of different cars. For example, you could get a station wagon. I love the way this looks like a Jeep in the back. They built trucks. They built all kinds of panel wagons, convertibles, hardtops. Basically, they were trying to make sure that their cars came up to appeal to just about any kind of buyer. Another interesting car that Crosley came up with was something called the Pharma Road. After World War II, they looked at everybody having fun with all their Jeeps and said, hey, maybe we could do something like that. Now, this particular one here at the Martin Auto Museum, as you can tell, has been kind of hot-rodded. It's got a new chassis underneath, better suspension and everything. But the concept was, once again, very simple for Crosley to make sure that they had something that appealed to a different market, the, well, farm market. Didn't sell a lot of these. They only sold them between 1950 and 1952, maybe sold 500 or 600 of them. Not a success, but once again, you got to give him credit. He had the right market, just not the right approach to it. So what happened to Crosley? Well, just because you're a visionary doesn't mean you have the right vision at the right time. After World War II, everybody was coming home, and guess what? They didn't want something small. They didn't want something inexpensive. They wanted something bigger, bolder. They wanted something that had more style, more flair. And well, the Crosley really was not that car. They actually did relatively well in sales after World War II. In fact, at one point, they sold more than 25,000 cars. But by 1952, well, they realized that the American public was just going in a different direction. And the Crosley Car Company came to an end. Interestingly enough, years later, guess what? The concept of a compact and this, the subcompact, became huge in America and around the world. People were buying these right and left. But in 1952, it just wasn't what America wanted. That post-World War era, this wasn't big enough, it wasn't bad enough, it wasn't bold enough. And as a result, the Crosley Car Company today is just a footnote in the world of automotive adventures.